You've probably heard this story. Roman legionaries were paid in salt. That's supposedly where the word salary comes from. A nice legend, isn't it? It's told in schools, repeated in documentaries, used in trivia contests. But what if I told you this story is one of the most persistent historical myths? Today, we're going on a real detective investigation. We'll untangle this web of historical misconceptions, learn how Roman soldiers were actually paid, and discover why salt really was more valuable than gold. Get ready. This story turns out to be far more interesting than you might think. Let's start with a simple question. Where did this story about salt even come from? It all began with the ancient Roman writer Pliny the Elder, who lived in the 1st century AD. In his encyclopedic Natural History, he wrote a phrase that spawned a millennium-long misunderstanding. Pliny mentioned that Roman soldiers received salarium, money for purchasing salt. Pay attention. He didn't say they were paid in salt. He said they were given money for salt. But over time, like in a game of telephone, the meaning became distorted. In the Middle Ages, when salt really was quite valuable in Europe, historians began interpreting Pliny's words literally. By the 18th to 19th centuries, the myth had firmly taken root. The romantic idea of legionaries receiving bags of salt instead of coins seemed too vivid to give up. Now let's turn to the real historical facts. The Roman army was perhaps the most organized military machine of the ancient world. And this organization extended to everything, including the payment system. We have numerous surviving documents, papyri from Egypt, stone inscriptions, military diplomas, historians' records. And you know what? Nowhere is there any mention of salt being issued as wages. Instead, we find a clear monetary system. Under Emperor Augustus, at the beginning of the 1st century AD, an ordinary legionary received 225 denarii per year. These were silver coins. A centurion might receive 15 to 20 times more. The Praetorian Guard, elite troops protecting the emperor, received double pay. But here's what's interesting. Deductions were made from this salary. A soldier had to pay for his own equipment, food, and clothing. All of this was deducted from his denarii. And imagine, sometimes salt really was mentioned in the list of deductions. But this only confirms that salt was purchased with money, not issued instead of it. All right, you might say, but why did this myth arise in the first place? Perhaps salt really was that valuable. And this is where the truly fascinating part of the story begins. Salt in the ancient world wasn't just a seasoning. It was a strategic resource, a vital commodity. Without refrigerators or canned goods, salt was the only way to preserve meat and fish for long periods. Without it, armies couldn't undertake distant campaigns. Without it, cities couldn't stockpile supplies for winter. The human body needs salt to survive. In hot climates, during heavy physical labor, during marches in full armor, the need for salt increases dramatically. Legionaries marching under the blazing sun lost enormous amounts of salt through sweat. In some regions, salt was scarce. Far from the sea, deep in the continents, it became a precious commodity. The Roman Empire controlled salt mines and coastal salt works. There was an entire network of roads for transporting salt. Some sections of the famous Roman roads were originally built specifically for salt delivery. One of the most famous is the Via Salaria, the salt road, leading from salt works at the mouth of the Tiber into the interior of Italy. This road still exists today. Now, for the most interesting part. While Roman legionaries were not paid wages in salt, there really were cultures in human history where salt was used as money. In medieval Africa, in the Sahara region, there was a thriving salt trade. Salt blocks from Taudeni in Mali were exchanged for gold at practically kilogram for kilogram. The Arab traveller Ibn Battuta in the 14th century described how in the city of Timbuktu, salt was valued at its weight in gold. In ancient China, they made coins from pressed salt. In Ethiopia, Salt bars called amole were used as currency well into the 20th century. In some Himalayan regions, pink rock salt served as a medium of exchange between tribes. Even in the Roman Empire, in distant provinces, salt was sometimes used for barter. But this was the exception, not the rule, and certainly not for regular troops. Let's return to the Roman legionaries and see how their payment system actually worked. Imagine it's the year 100 AD. You're a legionary in Germania, on the empire's frontier. 3 times a year, in January, May, and September, wages are paid. This is a ceremonial occasion. You're assembled in formation, the emperor's orders are read, and each soldier receives his portion of silver denarii. But that's not all. The system was more complex and sophisticated. You received part of the money in hand, but a significant portion was automatically deposited in the regimental treasury, a kind of forced savings. This was money for a rainy day, for retirement, for funeral expenses. The Roman army was perhaps the first in history to have something resembling a pension system. After 20 to 25 years of service, a legionary earned the right to discharge. And then he received his accumulated funds, either in money or as a land grant. A veteran could become a farmer, receiving a plot in one of the empire's colonies. There were also additional payments, donatives, gifts from the emperor on special occasions. A new emperor, upon ascending the throne, typically rewarded the army. Military booty after successful campaigns was divided among soldiers. Medals and awards often came with monetary bonuses. So why did the myth about salt wages survive for centuries? First, there's a poetic logic to it. The word salary really does derive from the Latin sal, salt. This linguistic connection seems too obvious to be coincidental. Though in reality, salarium meant precisely money for salt, not payment in salt. Second, in the Middle Ages and early modern period, salt really was very expensive in Europe. The salt tax in France, the infamous gabelle, was one of the causes of the French Revolution. When historians of the 17th to 18th centuries read about Salarium, they projected their own reality onto antiquity. Third, the story is simply appealing. It gives us a vivid image. Legionaries carrying sacks of white salt instead of clinking coins. It's romantic, unusual, memorable. A good story always beats boring facts. And finally, the myth took hold because it contains a grain of truth. Salt really was important to the army. Soldiers really did receive an allowance for purchasing it. The details were just distorted. This story is an excellent example of how historical myths are formed. Take a real fact, the salt allowance. Add an inaccurate translation or interpretation of an ancient text. Sprinkle with romanticization of the past. And there you have a myth that will live for centuries. Professional historians have known the truth for a long time, but the myth continues to spread in popular culture, in school textbooks, on the internet. Why? Because truth is more complex and less exciting than legend. The Roman military payment system was a complex bureaucratic machine with regular monetary payments, deductions, savings accounts, and pensions. This is impressive in its organization, but not as vivid as the image of a legionary with a sack of salt. Let's consider what we can really learn from this story. The Roman Empire created the first professional standing army in history. Before Emperor Augustus's reforms, soldiers were militia who served during wars and returned to their farms during peace. Augustus turned the army into a career. This required creating a sophisticated financial system. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers scattered throughout the empire from Britain to Mesopotamia needed to be paid regularly. A stable currency was needed, a tax system to support it, logistics to deliver money to distant garrisons. The Romans solved this problem. They created a system that worked for centuries. Silver denarii were minted in the millions and distributed throughout the empire. An extensive banking system existed for transferring funds. Military paymasters kept detailed accounts for each soldier. This was a marvel of organization for the ancient world. And this, not the mythical salt wages, is what makes the Roman army truly remarkable. While legionaries weren't paid in salt instead of money, it played an enormous role in their lives. The Roman military ration included grain, olive oil, wine, and, necessarily, salt. Soldiers baked their own bread in field ovens. They salted their food, preserved meat for long marches, used salt for tanning leather to repair equipment. On campaign, a legion needed huge quantities of salt. A 6,000-man army consumed tons of salt monthly. Quartermasters had to ensure supplies, negotiate with local merchants, organize transport. There were even military salt warehouses, Via Salaria. Major camps maintained salt reserves in case of siege. The loss of a salt convoy could be catastrophic for an army on campaign. So, while the myth about salt wages is false, the importance of salt to the Roman military machine can hardly be overstated. Someone might ask, so what? What difference does it make whether legionaries received salt or money? This is ancient history. But debunking historical myths is important for several reasons. First, it's a matter of intellectual honesty. If we want to understand the past, we must base our understanding on facts, not on appealing legends. History isn't a collection of entertaining stories, it's a science. Second, myths distort our understanding of how the ancient world worked. The notion of a primitive barter economy obscures the real complexity of Roman finance. The Roman Empire had a monetary economy, banking, credit, even something resembling checks. This was a sophisticated civilization, not a collection of barbarians exchanging salt for swords. Third, this story teaches us critical thinking. Don't believe everything you hear, even if it sounds authoritative. Verify facts, seek primary sources, ask questions. So we've unraveled the mystery of salt wages. Roman legionaries received silver denarii, not salt. The word salary comes from an allowance for salt, not payment in salt. But there's a deeper meaning to this story. It shows how complex and organized the Roman Empire was. It reminds us that history is full of misconceptions that seem convincing. And it teaches us to value truth over appealing legend. The next time you hear the phrase, Romans were paid in salt, you'll know the truth. And perhaps you'll pass this story along. The story of how myth became fact, and how scholarship restored to us the real past. Because the true history of Rome, with its monetary system, military bureaucracy, veteran pensions, and logistical marvels, is far more remarkable than any myth. Salt was important, but money ruled the world even 2,000 years ago.